Good morning.
Greetings, everybody.
I don't know if people can tell, like it's raining where I'm at, and I have a metal roof in my shed here, so I can't tell if everyone hears the little pitter patter. It's so soothing that if you fall asleep during this episode, I know it's not because of that we're boring. It's because of the gentle lull of the raindrops.
Yeah, but what if you fall asleep?
That'd be hilarious.
Sometimes
sounds good to me. I could take a nap right now.
You could take a nap. Yeah. Good morning, Kathleen. Oh my God, Kathleen has another amazing story.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So if she wants to share it in the comments or an abbreviated version, I would share it. But I'm not going to share it without her permission here.
That's
but it's like Missouri. It's just insane. All right. Anyway, I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing.
And I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I direct the Center for Prophetic Imagination. And
we're
talking about liberation theology again today.
Yes, part two. And Kathleen is giving me permission.
You can share it.
Okay, so here's just the super quick truncated version. And what's great about this story is that none of us really have any idea of what's going on. But basically, the night before last, Kathleen suddenly hears all kinds of commotion outside of her house. She then hears a lot of screaming, yelling, and a couple of gunshots.
Oof.
She hears a bunch of stuff about Cuba and Cuban illegal immigrants. It's all very confusing. And then she finally goes outside. Everybody's gone, except on the ground right in front of her house is this huge, thick folder labeled Homeland Security that is like somebody's file about something.
That's a security risk.
And so, talk about being left holding the bag. I mean, so she's now left with this folder and file, and hopefully a SWAT team is not on the way to her house to retrieve this. But yeah.
You might be able to get some good money if you could fax that to Russia.
There we go.
I'll do it. Ceres points out that there are songs about raindrops.
Yeah.
Hopefully,
only if it was falling. Only if it was falling in your head.
Yeah. You want to sing it for us, Dan?
No.
We're not that kind of show. That's extra. Yeah. Maybe if enough donations come in, you're dancing raindrops keep falling on my head.
No, that's pretty much guaranteed to drive away our non-existent donations. All right, and Sophia and Ceres were on a call last week together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
I think we were on a call together last week. So so it's nice when people are connected. It's a small world.
Connected.
Yeah,
that's another song.
Yeah, we're gonna just and lemon drops. We're just digressing all over the place.
Well, and we haven't had a robot bird report in a while.
I don't know. Bubo's not with you though.
No, Bubo's not with me. Bubo's on a mission. Bubo's on a secret mission.
I want to believe that robot birds are kind of like the Terminator movies, where there's some that are bad and some that are good, and that
and there's some that travel through time.
Yeah, that's where I think they came from. I've been thinking about this. These robot birds look so much like real birds. In fact, all birds are robot birds.
Right.
That we don't have the technology for that, so they have to have come from the future. And it's part of the inter-time agency's way of surveying all areas of the past. There've never been real birds. They've only ever been robot birds because it's future surveillance.
Oh, okay. So they've always been coming back.
Yes.
Always been coming back.
Yes. That's my
maybe even pterodactyls were an early model of robot birds.
Actually, they're an advanced model.
Yeah.
That's what
to survey the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
All right.
Speaking
So
of
liberation theology,
yeah.
part 2. So yesterday, by the end of the show, Kathleen has an update on her story.
I decided to send the file to an immigration attorney anonymously.
That sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, and maybe Bubo's getting the file from Kathleen.
Oh yeah. You could give it to Bubo, take it into the future, and see what happens.
Yeah. So liberation theology.
Right. So by the end of the day on Monday, part of what was happening, largely because of comments, was that people were pointing out that particularly here as time has gone on over the last several decades, there has really been an expansion of a lot of the basic kind of principles or thrust of liberation theology to include more and more groups. So Lisa, for example, mentioned a book called The Disabled God, which is a liberation theology connected to disabilities. I talked about the fact that there's now something called womanist theology, which is an intersectional liberation theology related particularly to people and women of color. People were talking about, liberation theology related to women in general. We have, you mentioned queer theologies. And a friend of mine, Pamela Lightsey, wrote a book that came out, I think, about 3 years ago now, called Queer Theology. There are several other books on that topic. And so one of the things that we've seen, right, over the years is basically to extend this idea or this impulse, or to recognize that the basic impulse is any kind of theology that really is of the religion of Jesus, as Thurman calls it, needs to extend to every human being, right? We need to acknowledge that every human being, first of all, is a human being, right? Which is something that we still have a hard time with. And that every human being and their particular perspective and slant and experience on life in this material world, and if they are marginalized, the oppression that they have experienced is an important part of understanding what the gospel is all about.
To me, this is threatening, and I want to kind of look at this from the perspective of why this is so scary to dominant religion people. Because there's a bunch of assumptions tied up in this that are actually very threatening. Because the dominant mode of Christianity for like white Westerners is that you have this God who is omni-everything, super powerful, and exists at the top of the hierarchy of being, right? So, and the proper relationship with that being is one of obedience. And so we find our fulfillment in obedience to the great sovereign. And that great sovereign is transcendent. And so by adhering through obedience, or by relying on grace alone, like there's different doctrinal ways of forming this, doing the thing in the proper way, then you are in harmony with this dominant being, and then you're blessed. Like that's kind of the way it works. And it's all based on, God is distant father figure, like all that stuff is kind of baked in. And then all of a sudden someone says, well, that's screwed up. Maybe God, if we want to think about the power of God, it should be from the bottom up, the way like life emerges from the goo, like a bubbling up of God's power. And that really, instead of God being like a king, God is like the oppressed. In fact, we can't, if we want to experience Christ at all, it's among the oppressed. And then instead of God being transcendent, God is found by giving attention to these struggles. In fact, the more comfortable you are with this obedience structure, the more you're going to have gaps in your perspective, and you're not going to be able to see things properly. In fact, these people who are oppressed understand what's screwed up with the system better because they get the short end of the stick. And God is primarily immanent and present with us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's dynamic. So it's not that there's not this one time for all times universal truth that we have to parse out with our calculator theologians to figure out what the principles are that we have to submit to out of obedience. It's instead we discern what the Spirit is doing in our midst. And there's this upending, this perpetual upending of these hierarchies of power. Two entirely different ways of thinking about the divine. And there's overlap. There's ways of synthesizing different bits of this. But if you're addicted to this hierarchy God, liberation theology is more than heretical. It's dangerous and evil. And that's why it's vilified. That's why there's like Southern Baptists are like, critical race theory is of the devil. Like, it's like we can laugh at them for being dumb, but it's like, well, no, they should be afraid. Their theology cannot work with that way of looking at things.
Got some comments coming.
Gus, I saw a meme about robot birds aren't real. It's a canard to throw us off the scent of the androids taking the place of people. Okay,
so birds are real, people aren't.
Gus, I'm sure you've watched Battlestar Galactica. The end of that, this is a spoiler, we are the descendants of the hybrid between organic beings and the Cylons. That's what we are. We are already half android. Just so you know.
Yeah.
Come on, Gus. Bring your game. I don't want your B game. I want your A game. Gus writes, I think, if I'm not mistaken, womanist is specific to Black women, specifically, not women of color more broadly. That's my understanding. It's a particularly American Black women, or at least emerged from there. I don't know if it's extended beyond that.
Yeah. Well, I think some of our listeners might want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, and part of the thing is like this important, and it's easy to criticize this because what happens is like, okay, so you have Black theology, but that's still like, you look at James Cone as an example of that. And so a Black woman would say, well, there's some perspectives that Black women would have that are important here. Or feminist theology, womenist theology could be seen as a critique of white feminist theology. And so from a certain perspective that wants everything to be universalized, it's like, oh, they're all fighting with each other. But like, no, this is part of the dynamic tension of new perspectives coming in. It's always going to cause conflict. And we got to stop being afraid of conflict. Otherwise, we're going to, and the only way to get rid of conflict is to see something like the Pax Romana, where you have a dominating system that stifles all sort of critique.
Right. Well, and it's not just conflict. It's also an issue of attachment. Right. So a particular, person, people, group, church get formed in a certain way of understanding God. They don't get that that's just a partial view. Right. They think it's the view. And then they get attached to that. And then somebody comes along and says, hey, I have a totally different view or a slightly different view of, the way God is working in the world. And that view is important. And then people freak out because their attachment gets in the way of their continued spiritual evolution, right? And this is the basic thrust of all spiritual teachings, right? Is that our attachment creates suffering because as soon as we bump up against somebody else or some other group or something else in the world that has this different perspective, because all of our perspectives are partial, we immediately freak out. And then we want to kill the other person because, they're a threat to us. And so, how understanding that basic issue and mechanism is extremely important in liberating us, right? That we're actually excited to hear all the other new perspectives and how it is that other folks are really hearing and understanding this, right? And, like Jim Bear Jacobs, who's a friend of ours, Native American pastor, he talks about this in terms of the Bible. He said, instead of white people coming and telling natives what the Bible means, really what what would be a much better process is if white people come, bring the Bible to Native people and say, why don't you tell us what this means?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because you have this totally other indigenous perspective, which is much more what actually a lot of the biblical stories came out of. And we're reading it through this power colonialist point of view that is not seeing it very clearly at all.
Mm-hmm. Catherine writes, disability theology and queer theology, etc., have existed as long as queer and disabled people have been talking about it. What we're seeing now is maybe more academic literature getting published about it. I mean, this is an important point, just to kind of stick with it a little bit. One of the concepts that's kind of you find in a lot of liberation theologies is this centering on praxis. Okay, and so praxis, for those who aren't familiar with the different ways it's used, it can mean different things, but at basic level, it's that truth isn't truth until it's embodied. So you don't have this idea that's superior and then you figure out how to live it out. And so that the onus is on the purity of the truth. It's truth doesn't exist until it's lived out. And then you understand, like, so there's a cycle. These truths from experience should inform our thinking more than the other way around, or at least it's more dynamic than that. And part of the challenge to this is people doing liberation theology, when we've inherited these academic systems that privilege this top-down dissemination of information. And so queer theologies haven't been published until recently. But if we believe in the idea of praxis, then people have been doing queer theology for a long time. And we need to figure out how, as churches in particular, in these communities of faith that should be praxis-centered rather than doctrinally centered, how we honor that generation of theology from its source rather than waiting for it to like get taken into the lofty halls of academia and then kind of filtered back out.
Well, and I do think, though, that there's also this issue of we're doing a lot of things unconsciously or without awareness. Mm-hmm. And then spaces are created in which what we are doing already is kind of lifted up into awareness, right? Yeah. So at one point on Monday, we mentioned these, peasant process groups. Mm-hmm. That was one of the sources of, again, a more formal liberation theology. Mm-hmm. And so and so what happened there, right, was that folks started gathering these peasants together and reading the Bible. And then, these people started going, wow, like these folks in the Bible are just like us. They're people working the land. There are all these stories about farming. There's all these stories about people being oppressed by the king. There's like all this stuff that sounds exactly like our lives. And boy, it really sounds like this Jesus guy wants to help us more than wants to help the king. Right. And so what they were already living out started to get lifted up into conscious communal awareness. And so that's this praxis process that is so important, right? That creating space for maybe what people have already been doing for, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, now begins to kind of percolate upward, as you were talking about, into the awareness of lived communities, faith communities, and then, perhaps gets disseminated more widely.
And this is always the challenge, like in these spaces for people who are scholars. If you want to make a living as a scholar, you want to work at an institution like the academy, but to me, the most exciting scholars are movement scholars. It's usually one of the terms that I've heard used for people who kind of don't ever attach themselves to a particular institution, or they spend most of their time kind of doing the work. They're part of movements, and then they create space for scholarship and study more in that context. And it's always this tension, Mm-hmm. And so to me, liberation, this is where liberation theology has to move beyond just an idea, if we look around and look at our churches and our institutions and ask who are they serving, who benefits, that's a very liberationist question to ask. And it's a huge, gigantic uphill battle. And what ends up happening, as we know, mainline denominations in particular, who want to seem really liberal, will say liberationist things, but then kind of cling to these anti-liberationist structures. So this is part of the challenge of what Christian supremacy looks like right now. Anyways, I could talk about that kind of stuff all day, but we need to move on. Ceres writes, Bible disproves the distant father thing. Yeah, it's kind of the idea of an absentee landowner father God is not really very biblical, or at least not predominantly biblical. Much of community law and system is informed by shalom. Yeah. Sophia writes, this is why liberation theologies are so threatening to some Christians. Completely upends their worldview, understanding of God, and relationship to God neighbor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely. And it not only completely upends their worldview and their understanding, but then it also has to upend how they live, right? So, we've often talked about, Black Lives Matter signs in rich neighborhoods. And, to me, the next question always is, okay, so if you were to go to that community and knock on all those doors and say, would you agree to a 10% wealth tax that would go directly to reparations as direct cash payments to, folks who have suffered slavery and oppression and dislocation and all the things that America has done to these people, suddenly the Black Lives Matter signs would be less appealing.
Yes, I suspect that you're right. Ellen writes, the word Lord should be understood as subversive. I mean, this is there's so many nuances about how to read texts that get lost. And then, just to kind of flesh this up before reading it, get lost because we think that somehow the idea of reading the parables from the perspective of the dispossessed is somehow fancy theological trickery, rather than it's just a completely different way of looking at things. And so this is what happens when you give people who've experienced oppression the freedom to interpret the Bible as more and instruct the rest of us, as you start finding these things. And it's not because they're highfalutin scholars. It's because they are not so ensnared with these domination system ways of thinking. And so here's Alan's point. The word Lord should be understood as subversive and reappropriating power. But usually people hear Lord and project the meaning of Lord onto God without any nuance, which is super dangerous because God becomes the image of hierarchy rather than the human leaders becoming the image of God. Amen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and people are projecting the meaning that they've been taught over and over again, right? So if you just hear, Lord King, Father, God, Lord King, over and over and over again for your whole church life, I mean, that's, and then you see people, up in a high pulpit somewhere with, fancy, weird stuff on, and and then you've got a picture of Jesus that looks just like the white guy that's up in the pulpit with the fancy stuff on. I mean, you get formed in that, right? And so of course you project that formation back onto the text whenever you read it, and you do that completely unconsciously. I mean, it's just, that's the way formation works.
Yeah, and this is, I'm just going to push this idea I've already brought up again, and it's one of the more offensive things to people. Like when I tell people that it's problematic when our primary relationship with God and Jesus is one of obedience, because that's been dominant. That's so dominantly taught that what it means to be a disciple is to obey Jesus. Well, and there's some truth to that, but you got to look at what Jesus said to. He said, if you're going to follow my commandments, follow this one: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. So he's subverting the idea of what it means to be obedient to God. And there's a great book for those who are looking for things to dig into. Dorothy Sola, who was a German feminist theologian, liberationist, wrote a book called Beyond Mere Obedience. And she talks about this idea of like, when we already have this assumption that God's up here and we obey, we're just going to perpetuate oppression. We have to think about beyond mere obedience. And that's hard for people because we're told our whole lives that you have to just do what Jesus says rather than understand Jesus's heart and do likewise, which is a very subtly but powerfully different thing. Kathleen writes, when I entered seminary 30 years ago, I was skeptical of liberation theology. Then I had a class where we were supposed to invent new words for a feminist class. My entry was ministration, monthly council meetings. I suddenly loved feminist theology. I also, like, my big problem with liberation and feminist theology is, besides me feeling personally attacked as a white man and somehow buying the Rush Limbaugh idea that somehow is the most oppressed person in America. There was that part of it. But also, people
that little part.
Yeah. But the thing I would say out loud is that it's liberation theology is works-based righteousness. So this is another area like where we think Christianity at its heart is this idea of grace as interpreted through Augustine and the reformers to us, that you don't have to do anything and you accept the free gift of life if you say the prayer, like that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden someone says, well, if you want to worship Jesus, you have to encounter him with the oppressed. Like, whoa, that's works righteousness. And, it's interesting reading stuff about what grace actually means from a liberationist perspective. It's not this you get out of jail free card, because most liberationists aren't into hell that much. It's about you can experience the fullness of God's presence here, which is way funner sounding than like God doesn't want to kill you.
Yeah. Well, and it's also that God is for you if the world is crushing you.
Yeah. And the good news for us with power is we can be a part of this movement that, the kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. If we are willing to lay aside our investments in the domination system and be a part of the beloved community instead. That's what the gospel is for us. Sophia writes, yes, recognizes and validates lived experience. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing, like, as an evangelical, I heard all the time that you can't do theology from a place of experience because you're just easily deceived. You have to read the Bible, and you can't just read it any old way yourself. Here's Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, where he tells you how to understand the Bible. Yeah, and somehow dropped from heaven.
Yeah, well, and this is not. This is not sort of some ancient concept, right? Within the most imperial form of Christianity, right, Roman Catholicism. Regular people are still encouraged to not read the Bible. If you go into a Catholic church, you will not find a Bible pretty much anywhere. And there is this idea that, you need the right people to interpret the Bible for you. And if you read it, you might get wrong ideas. Right? They even talk about that. Right? Because suddenly, hey, you might see this a little differently than, Cardinal abuser dude is telling you what it means.
That's right. So it's so trippy that like some of the most powerful liberationist voices have come from within the Catholic Church. And so I bring that up because, like, everyone wants to say, like, oh, Catholicism is bad, you should be Episcopalian instead, that somehow that moves you away from oppression. I'm like, no, like, Oscar Romero, Dorothy Day, the Latin American liberation theologians, feminists, there's even Catholic queer theologians. It's not, it comes... Anytime people experience oppression and they're asking God questions, liberation theology is going to emerge. Let's see, we lost track of the comments. Oh, Marlene writes, really come to appreciate this podcast. Thank you for all your insights. You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Sophia says, yes, which means self-reflection, repentance, seeing a different reality doesn't censor their comfort.
Yep.
Yes.
Exactly.
Ceres writes, disembodiment is a part of Christian supremacy. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Just from top to bottom, the idea that somehow God is absent from the land, that somehow human beings are above the rest of creation, that we can't trust our senses and that pleasure is bad. Like all this stuff is baked into white supremacy and Christian supremacy.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you tell people that they can't trust what they're feeling and sensing, you got to be really wary of that, because that's immediately whoever's saying that is trying to control you.
Yeah, it's 2,000 years of gaslighting.
Yeah.
David Lant writes, "Obey and it will be okay" is a very powerful story that kept me enslaved for most of my life, and I passed that slavery on as a good minister.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just so people know, like, sometimes people miss the nuances in this. It's not like I'm saying like we shouldn't give a shit what God says, or we shouldn't like look at Jesus as a powerful figure or someone who even has authority in our lives. It's just we got to think differently about this authority and power stuff. God doesn't want for us just to like write down every list, every rule, and then try to live it out. That mentality creeps its way into leftist spaces all the time with white performers who want to just do the right thing and who remain fundamentally untransformed. And then they get confused when people of color don't trust that. Because they know that if I'm just trying to perform, the first time it's too hard for me to perform, I can just revert back totally to being as white supremacist and shitty as I was before, because there was no transformation involved. God's love is about transformation, not about just conformity. Like we need to break that bad habit. Kathleen writes, "I have really enjoyed this today. Thank you."
You're welcome.
Thank you,
Be
Kathleen.
careful with your files.
Yes. Gus writes, "The other reason I was hesitant to embrace liberationist thinking was understanding syncretism as an option to choose, liberationist or not, dominant forms." Yeah, that's one of the greatest little tactics that dominant theology does. Dominant theology is syncretic with capitalism, nationalism, etc. If it that and Marx passed me some more of old Carl. Like that's the thing. It's like you can't. There's no such thing as not pure any religion. It's all syncretism, and so we need to be aware of it as much as possible, so we can have integrity with how we think and move in the world.
Yeah,
that's the goal, not some sort of pure. Even the Bible has syncretism. The resurrection isn't in the Hebrew scriptures because they're like that idea bumped across from like Babylon and Egypt, and they're like, that's a good idea. And then it morphed into this beautiful doctrine of the resurrection. It's like truth doesn't just. Yeah. Anyways, I could go off on that. Let's. We're running out of time, and I'm getting verbose. Series writes, "The flip sides of obedience is that we have the idea that God needs to obey and react to our shenanigans." Interesting. I'd love to hear more about that. Basically, codependency. Ellen writes, "Dan, can you talk about attachment being suffering juxtaposed with disembodiment? Is there liberation theology in Buddhism?"
Well, so attachment being suffering. So attachment is actually a sort of form of disembodiment, right? In the sense that we kind of freeze our experience at a particular moment, or a particular moment, or a particular way of being in the world, and we then actually stop sensing and paying attention, and so that so that it's the more that we continue to engage our embodiment, the freer from attachment we become. And so, and the whole issue of Buddhism and how it relates to its political landscapes in different cultures is a very interesting conversation that we don't have time for right now, but might be fun to bring up sometime.
Reminds me of a comment the other day. It's ironic that you discuss liberation theology from a person coming from rich, dominant, white, Western, middle-class, elitist perspective. Three things. There's too many assumptions in that statement. Second thing, white people have to talk about. We can't. Am I supposed to just spout off dominant theology? Like, our whole point is here is not trying to tell people what liberation means. It's to say, look, There's feminist, black, womanist, there's all these theologies that we need to attend to, and they're telling us something, and we need to listen to it instead of regurgitating these dominant modes.
Mm-hmm.
And people in power need to do this, and this is always the pitfall of white people using this in order to establish themselves instead of divest themselves. So right now, there's a very real sense that part of my job is talking about this stuff, and so I benefit from it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the tension. But we have to create spaces within the dominant systems to talk about these heavy things. Otherwise, the only real solution, and I'm not saying this humorously at all, like if we don't think about how white, powerful people and men can find their place within a liberated system, the only alternative is the guillotine. Like, we either find, I say this all the time because it's either transformation or violent revolution. And if there's going to be dominating Christian supremacy, white supremacy, it's going to be perpetuated, and you can't call folks into it like the rich young ruler, then at some point they're going to have to be stripped from power or killed. That's kind of
and I guess what the other thing I would just say about this is or another thing that I would say about this is that I mean, white men should not be the only people that one is listening to in relation to any of this.
For God,
right?
No.
And and that and most of my teachers are not white men. In fact, I would say almost 100% of them, certainly at this point. And so but at the same time, and again, as you said, Mark, this is the tension, and you sort of hear this all the time, right? So on the one hand, white folks cannot be constantly going to non-white folks saying, "Explain all this to me." And at the same time, right, when white people talk about these things, we have to be very aware of our biases and where we're coming from. But we have to talk about them. I mean, white people have to talk about this. White people have to figure out the way in which, we are malformed by the system, and work towards liberation of that, as well as promoting and giving space for liberation for everybody else as well.
And this is why, just to reiterate something you said earlier, this is why it can't just be this academic masturbation thing, like, I really like these ideas of liberation. In the perfect world, this is what it would look like. Meanwhile, I'm going to just do my regular life. It has to come from lived experience. And for me, that means lived experience of struggling with what it means to decenter myself in these sorts of, like, understanding what it means to be the church in the world. Mm-hmm. It also means, like, being clear and honest about areas where I benefited from the system and where I have not, because I'm not everything isn't purely in the I benefit from column, and having integrity with it, not being bullshitty, because, like, I'm gonna pick on this all the time, like with white mainline Christianity, there's so much doublespeak about this. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that I think we should be afraid of, like, is people, and we see this in movement spaces all the time, people saying the right words, they're performing it, but then they're finding a way to benefit from the domination system while somehow getting cachet in the movement too, without ever really challenging the fundamental framework, the fundamental way of doing in the world. And so everything you said raises this bigger question of how do we do this with integrity? And even though I'm a little churlish, I guess, about how you pitched it to me, but the point is still a well-made one.
Final comment, and then we've got another day of this on Fascism Friday. Thurman has this term about relaxation in connection to this issue of attachment. Yes, so Thurman, this concept that he's using from an early 20th century writer on the experience of religion and mysticism. Yes, that is very similar to the issues around attachment. You are relaxing your attachments. And for Thurman, that was one of the key things that helped people move into an embodied, liberated space. So, yes, absolutely. All right.
Way past time. We haven't gone this for a while. But it's fun. Good topic. And thanks for all the comments. And I don't know where we're going to go with this Friday, but there's still so much more we could talk about. So who knows?
See ya.
See you Friday.